Thanks very much, Sue. And can I just say this is the hottest meeting for quite a long time, so I'll try to keep it brief. Well done for everyone who's come. I can see an awful lot of people who were in the same place a week ago. It's been deja vu. And clearly there is a commitment of people to come 2 Saturdays running to discuss the situation that we're now in. And I was one of those who believed that both meetings were actually really important. It was very important last week to get activists together to maximise the pressure on those unions who were seeking to withdraw from the coalition of industrial action. And it's now equally right that we meet to take into account what's happened in the last 5 or 6 days. And in some ways what has happened doesn't lend itself to just entirely optimistic speeches that are about clarion calls of the way forward. We need a very honest assessment about what has happened. How it has happened so quickly. What does it tell us about the state of the rank and file in some of Britain's biggest unions, and where that leaves us now in terms of the way forward. And let me be clear right from the outset. I think the idea that the same calls and slogans we made when there are 30 unions and 2.5 million people do not apply in exactly the same circumstances as when that coalition has fractured. In fact, I'll go further. If we don't understand the material difference of the position that we're in and work out where that takes us, I think we're all doing ourselves a disservice, because I think we invite potentially a defeat that we all are desperate to avoid. And in that sense, I want to set out what I think should be now the type of decisions and issues that we need to take on board in the next few weeks. I will do it, though, from a point of view of saying in all of my time in the trade unions, which is now into my 3rd decade, I think the strikes on June the 30th and November the 30th were some of the greatest things that any of us have participated in. And they were built by strong activism, a real good rank and file who were prepared to shout that they needed to do things about the cuts that were facing them. It was combined with strong leadership in a small number of unions in Britain, and let me pay tribute to the leaderships of the UCU and the NUT and the PCS in particular, but also the ATL, who were prepared to call a strike on June the 30th. Because most people were denouncing us in the TUC for calling a strike on June the 30th. They made common cause with the government and said it was irresponsible, that the talks hadn't ended. It is a fact, in my view, that the strike on June the 30th transformed the situation in this country. It actually said that people are prepared to say no, they are prepared to fight back, and it directly led to November the 30th. But then I think we have to ask ourselves some questions, really, which is, if November the 30th was one of the greatest days in the trade union movement in recent times, how can it have gone from that to where we are in breathtaking speed that we have seen in the run-up to Christmas and afterwards? And we have to analyse how that has happened. Because the fact of the matter is, and let's not mince our words, the deals on offer in all of the 4 schemes are as miserable and as pathetic as anything you could wish to see. Any attempt to talk up that we have made real progress, that this is the best that we can get, it is utterly pathetic. In fact, I think it's interesting, in unions like Unison, where efforts have been made over the last few weeks to ram through a position that withdraws Unison from the strikes. Very interesting from the reports that I got from the Unison meetings on Tuesday, because the meeting started with vicious attacks on the PCS leadership and the role that we have played. They went on to talk about the fact that nobody can deliver more strike action, and they ended with the idea that there's a 15-slide presentation that Heather Wakefield's put together for local government that tells us all about the detail on accrual rates, death in service benefits, and all the peripheral stuff. That is not why we went on strike. Now, I generally think if you've got a deal that's worth arguing, you start from what's good about the deal. And it tells us quite a lot about what is on offer is miserable. But if it is miserable, why did we have the strike on the 30th? Why did those unions call a strike on the 30th if actually they were going to seek to withdraw within a matter of days and weeks? And I think that's something that we need to think about. Is it a coincidence, for example, that it is this week that we have effectively seen at the trade union meeting that the overwhelming bulk of unions have indicated they do not want to carry on, that Ed Balls is today in the media supporting pay freezes, supporting job checks and everything else. And does that mean that actually there is a real fear there's a fear amongst the leaderships of some of our unions, which is also held by the leaders of the Labour Party, that what our strike was actually about was arguing for a complete alternative to the direction of travel taken by all the mainstream political parties. And that is what we were advocating, and that is what scares them so much. And then I think you have to say, well, if that's the case, then how have they been able to go from a situation of having to strike to where we are now, and what's gone along with it? Well, you need to know, I think, that many of these unions never wanted to be in November the 30th. They probably calculated they couldn't avoid it. I, with Kevin, was in the negotiations all the way along with the government. And I said this last week, but I think it's worth repeating. Can you ever imagine a situation where in crunch talks with the government, where all the unions are lined up facing a team of Treasury officials, ministers from the Cabinet, that not once but twice does Brendan Barber, the leader of the TUC, after I had made contributions ruling out an increase in the state pension age as a matter of principle, and saying that the concessions on the second were nowhere near enough, told the government in front of everyone he completely disagreed with the view that I had put forward, and on one case that I was speaking for myself and not for anyone else. Now, it's not a surprise that in less than 6 hours the media was running stories about the unions as split, the TUC was distancing itself from wild left-wingers like me, and that actually they didn't really want to be where they wanted to be. It sowed the seed for some of the division that we later saw. And the proof of that ultimately was on Tuesday of this week. Because on Thursday, of this week. Because the meeting at the TUC, I think you all need to understand, was as grim as those meetings can get. Ritualistic. Ritualistic in its denunciations, criticism, hostility towards anyone who has been prepared to argue that this is wrong. And not just the way that it normally is. It probably gives us a slight glimpse as to what life's like in Unison for people. But I do think that actually how full on it was actually needed to be seen to be believed. And two things form the basis of that attack. One is it's a disgrace if anybody criticises the leaders of any union. And I said it last week, I'll say it now. Now is not the time for diplomatic niceties. Now is the time to be honest to our members and honest to our activists. And if people find that threatening, then so be it. And I would rather be in a minority, in a room with the NUT, with the POA, and with others who were prepared to stand up last week, arguing on behalf of our members' interests, than going along with the club of union leaders who, in my view, are carrying out here one of the biggest betrayals that we have seen. So that's why I'm very happy that I come here, and every time I speak, and Sean made comments about what I did before Christmas in the media, is the reason I'm getting up and saying that the deal is miserable, that we should call further strikes, that we should reject it out of hand, is because that was the position unanimously taken by the executive in PCS. And the executive in PCS this week, as Sue has said, unanimously reaffirmed our rejection, that we should call on further public sector-wide strikes, and if we don't get them, that we should call a meeting of all those unions who still want to fight. Now, I think that tells us quite a bit about the difference in the outlook of some of the unions. The PCS executive is unanimous. It's unanimous across a fairly broad spectrum, and it's unanimous because people have accepted, if you tell members they're going on strike against working longer, paying more and get less, and they all still face working longer, paying more and getting less, trying to sell them anything else is a crock of shit. Temporarily leave us in a smaller minority than we would like to be. But the reality is, it's not the minority that the government thought it was on December the 22nd. Because on December the 22nd, they announced to Parliament that only one union in Britain had rejected what they were doing, which was the PCS, and to the usual pantomime chorus of boos and shames in Parliament from the Tories, they decided to demonise us. Now, I think that was a stupid tactic, because one of the greatest things about Christmas, apart from my presents, was that actually what you saw over Christmas was union after union after union saying, well, that's not us. The education unions unite, first of all in the civil service, then in health, then in local government. NIPSA in Northern Ireland. POA clarifying clearly that they have not signed the agreement. Ending in a situation of, far from being isolated and on our own, we get back to a situation that we're talking about unions representing in the region of 1 million people. Now, some of those unions have used different formulations. I think we need to understand that. Not everybody has rejected it all out of hand. Some people are hedging their bets a bit more than others. But what we know is there is that core coalition. And I think this is what we now got to consider carefully in terms of the way forward. The first thing I think we've got to ask ourselves is, what does it tell us about the state of the left and the rank and file in some of the unions in Britain? Now, I think, sadly, we have to conclude that in some unions, in possibly the best circumstances we could wish for, a mass strike, incredibly popular, everybody out together for the first time in years, if some union leaderships feel bold enough to think against that, they can get away with this dreadful deal, it tells us something about the assessment that they're making about the balance of forces. And I think, therefore, we have got to redouble our efforts to say it is important that the battle continues in every union, that we don't give up, that we may have to use different arguments and different tactics, but unless we can overcome some of the betrayal that we have seen in the last few weeks, what hope is there for further coordinated strikes on pay? What hope is there for further coordinated strikes against mass privatisation? If you go into something in the knowledge that key partners can withdraw at the drop of a hat, it is something that we have to consider carefully. Because, of course, the irony of where we are is that the one-day strike in November was our strength. It was brilliant. It was the best place we've ever been. But you cannot deny that where we are now in the eyes of lots of people is massively set back. And I think we do need to understand that a strike of 1 million is brilliant. But if a strike of 1 million follows a strike of 2.5 million, you have to accept that that means we have gone backwards. We've gone backwards, hopefully temporarily, but we've gone backwards. And why am I saying this here? Because I think this is what members will say. They will say to us that we need to understand why some unions have withdrawn and others haven't. Why, if a strike of 2.5 million didn't shift the government, do we believe now that a strike of less than half of that is going to have the effect on them that we want? And I think, comrades, if we're honest, we know that it won't. We know that it's not just enough for us to say name a day and name it quickly in the absence of having a very clear and worked out strategy. And that, to me, is the type of discussion that we're going to have. Because I have no doubt the PCS members, if we call them out on strike, would, in their majority, support us as they would in the NUT. But there is more to being in the leadership, whether that's at rank and file level or at national level, than just saying we can manage to get our members out on strike. We've got to know what it means to achieve, what's going to happen after it. And my own view is that actually it's an absolute irrefutable logic that if there's less people in the coalition, there's less members and there's less unions, you have to be prepared to do more than when there is more of you. Because a strike of 1 million does not have the effect of a strike of 2.5 million. And this is why I think Kevin, and I completely agree, and in fact I think the PCS executive took the view that we need to pause for some thought. We need to pause and ask ourselves these questions. Firstly, we should call on the TUC to call a strike. Well, let me tell you, we did that immediately. We proposed that there should be an immediate public sector-wide strike on Thursday, and we were supported only by the NUT. That is the reality of the meeting. One union supported the call for an immediate move to a public sector-wide strike. Now we haven't got it. We've called on the TUC, we haven't got it, we've now got to look where we are. Now our fallback position is to ask all of those unions who've rejected the heads of agreement to meet now as a matter of urgency and have a real honest discussion and assessment about what it is we need. What type of action do we need in order to shift them? How do we deliver that action? Who's going to be involved? And what does it look like? And I have to say to you, in my opinion, it is actually more important to get a hard-hitting strategy agreed that we deliver than immediately now calling for a strike that we know will raise as many questions as it answers. Now that's not everybody's view, but I tell you that is very clearly my view. Because when I ask PCS members to now lose more money and come out and strike, I want to be able to tell them who's with them, what action we're going to call next, and how we have a strategy designed to force more pressure on the government. And that may take some time to get agreed. This is not a sprint, it is ultimately a marathon. We have not got to win or lose in the next 4 or 5 weeks, we've actually got to win. and we've got to win as best that we can over whatever period it takes. Therefore, the PCS is hoping that all of the unions who reject will come to a meeting, will be prepared to talk about the type of strike action that we need. Is that different? Is it more than a day at a time? Is it about longer, sustained industrial action? Is it about targeted action in addition to national action? What role do we play for action short of a strike as part of an industrial action campaign? And how do we build enough pressure on the government where, if we're honest, the role of the leaderships of other unions won't be to benignly sit back and say, good on you then. They'll want us to lose. If you have signed a crap deal, the last thing you want is somebody fighting and getting better than you, because it blows your arguments out of the water. So some of these people are not going to be neutral. They're going to be hoping that we go down to defeat. And I think that means that we have absolutely got to be prepared to have these discussions. And I want to finish on this. I don't want anyone to read into this, or is this a bit downbeat? Is this not just a straightforward that I'm coming here to say I'm going to propose on Thursday an immediate one-day strike of whoever can be involved? It's not downbeat. It is actually a message that is full of the optimism that class struggle can win, but it's never easy, and you've got to be able to ascertain and take stock of your tactics. And it seems to me an absolute truism that if you go from a strike of 500,000 in June to a strike of 2 million in November, everyone can see there's an upwards curve. If that now suddenly becomes a strike of 1 million or 500,000, on the face of it, it looks like we are coming down the other side. If people think we're coming down the other side, they will think we are protesting and doing it because we should, rather than because we believe that we can win. Now's not the time to just be protesting. Now is the time to show them we're going to fight to win, because the stakes are getting higher and higher every single day. Therefore, my message today, I think, is to say in all of our unions, we've got to rededicate ourselves to trying to assert the role of the rank and file, the people who ultimately are the ones whose pensions are being stuffed, whose pay is being frozen or cut, and whose jobs are going. Unions are the property of their members. It is demonstrable to me, given the activities of the last 3 weeks, that most of the unions involved in that coalition are not the property of their members. They are the property currently of leaders who think they can move pieces around the chessboard at their whim. Leaders who play fast and loose by saying we haven't agreed to anything, we've only agreed to talk. Our members will be balloted at a time of our convenience. People who are going to say to their members, it's the best you can get, or we are actually threatening you with the fact you'll have to take long-term sustained industrial action. Not using it as something that should boost people's belief that they can win, but actually as some threat as to why they should accept a terrible deal. That's currently the situation and state of play in a number of our unions. And for absolute clarity, let people know this, that you know that over the last few weeks, PCS has been excluded by the government of any talks. We raised on Thursday that the TUC should protest. I have to tell you, it was a pretty difficult place to even get them to agree that they should argue that we're allowed back in the talks. In fact, 2 union leaders essentially said, this is the argument, we paid a price for the ticket to get in the club of having talks. Why should we have freeloaders who have not given anything up to be allowed to come into the talks? And that was the attitude of our sister unions in the civil service. Absolutely astonishing. I tell you what, the government has this morning conceded that now we're going to be back in the talks. But the real important thing about the letter that I've just had, and this is the thing that conclusively proves our point, is the letter says this: you should know that in the talks you will be invited to, along with the other civil service unions, you will not be able to raise the question of retirement age, you will not be able to raise the question of RPI, and you will not be able to raise the questions of contributions. Now on one level, it makes me think, can I be asked to get out of bed? But it is the proof of something else. Every union who's accepted the heads of agreement has already accepted those terms. And it does not mean they are discussing the core of their members' pensions. They are discussing the minutiae around the side and dragging it out to get them out of the frame. And that means that we have got to be still applying the pressure in those unions, absolutely as a matter of urgency. So comrades, I'll leave you with this thought. November the 30th was the best of trade unionism and class struggle. What has happened afterwards is the worst of trade unionism in Britain. And the battle is on. The battle is on to reclaim our unions and to fight to defend our members and their communities. or is to take the view that we have lost. And let's be clear, we will have lost. I know where I am every time. It is to fight on, to reclaim the unions and force the government backwards. But if that is the size of our task, it means understanding that there is more we now need to talk about and do, not less. There is more clear analysis that we need to do, and ultimately it means we're going to need harder hitting and more strike action, and if it takes us a while to get the unions to that conclusion, so be it. Better to have hard hitting strike action that can win than rush at something that potentially leaves us divided and demoralised. I hope that you can have discussions today around those themes. Thank you for all that you have done. Good luck to those who are in the unions who are absolutely letting their members down, and thank you to those who are in unions who have been supporting their leadership and been prepared to fight.